Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is our second webinar focused on the impact of the new Trump administration on higher ed. This one is totally devoted to answering your questions. So we're really excited to be with you today. I am the Chronicle's news editor, and I'm here with Rick Seltzer, a senior editor or senior writer rather at the Chronicle. Rick,
Yes,
how's it
sir.
going? What's new?
I'm doing great. How are you? We are T minus 11 days to St. Patrick's Day, so I'm excited on that front. I don't know if you are. You seem dressed like you're excited for it.
I am preemptively making sure that I'm not going to get punched on St. Patrick's Day. Do you have like elaborate plans or something? Or are you just excited generally?
Both my own and my wife's family's Irish heritage makes it's one of our favorite holidays of the year. You know, we've got the shepherd's pie ready to go, and we'll put on some music and have a great little time. Great time.
Any holiday that involves food, honestly, pro. So I'm gonna go ahead and get started with a poll here. We are really devoted today to answering your questions. So please weigh in. Which topic should we tackle first today? Now, to be clear, we're going to try to get to as many questions as possible that you all have submitted on in all of these categories to the extent that we can. But do you want to start with college finance, crackdowns on protests, federal student aid, DEI guidance, research funding, or the education department's final mission? Please let us know. Yes, we know, elephant in the room, that it is very possible that we are going to get an executive order from President Trump announcing that he wants to dismantle the education department while we're in this webinar. We really might get it in the middle of the webinar. So we know we are prepared to talk about it. Don't worry, we're getting there. So please weigh in. While you guys weigh in on that, just wanted to flag that this is a follow up event to one that we ran 2 weeks ago. 10,000 people joined us live, and there was so much we didn't cover. And a lot of what we didn't get to cover is your questions. So today we're really just going through your questions. We've gotten 2,500 questions in advance, and we will run through as many of those as we can. I will also try to take a few questions live. The Q&A is open for connecting with other attendees, so please feel free to engage there. Be respectful, be civil, please. The chat, meanwhile, is closed, but we will be posting resources there. The only other thing is that if you want to stay up to date on the latest with the Trump administration, Rick is your person. He writes our daily briefing, our subscriber only newsletter. The only way to get it is to subscribe to the Chronicle. And so I just wanted to flag that if you want to really keep up with the day to day in the Trump administration, Rick's got you. Subscribe to the Chronicle so you can get the daily briefing.
Yeah, I try to make that newsletter a combination of the great Chronicle coverage that our own reporters do, stories from around the web that we just cannot get to for various reasons, and also I try to add as much of my original reporting as possible in between all of that, which these days is increasingly exhausting, but it is exhausting in a good way because hopefully it's a good service for everyone. Now, while we wait for the poll at the end, let me ask you one important question, Sarah, that I know we talked about, we wanted to get to. Let's make sure we get to this one out of the way, get this one out of the way, and then we'll go on to what the viewers want us to address. This question came in. Do Trump's threats to yank federal funding for institutions that do not comply with his administration's priority, do those threats affect private colleges instead of just public colleges, and small private colleges in particular? A lot of folks asked if they can be affected by the federal threats.
Yes. So this is a really interesting question. I think a lot of people might think, well, public colleges are government entities. It's understandable that they would be affected by what Trump is doing. Private colleges are not. So why would we be? A lot of people seem to question, would we even be affected? The answer is quite the simple answer is yes. Federal guidance and executive orders apply to you too. There are some distinctions here, right? I mean, public colleges are subject to the Constitution. Meanwhile, some public and private colleges are federal contractors that have direct relationships with the federal government. So there are some differences there. But by and large, this guidance, for example, on diversity, equity, and inclusion and Title VI, that applies to private colleges. The latest Q&A from the Trump administration explicitly says we will be applying the same standards to public and private colleges. Now, in terms of investigations, threats to federal funding that we have seen so far, we're going to get into that. Trump has mostly been going after like the big private institutions, big name private institutions, Columbia, for example, Northwestern. But like in terms of the like actual letter of the law, yes, public and private colleges are both affected. Does that sum it up, Rick? Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think so. I think the big lever that the federal government has is federal financial aid and the funding that students draw from the federal government. That to be a college that can accept that money, you have to agree to do certain things with the feds, and you are subject to all sorts of laws. So that's the lever, and that's what they use to uh, threaten, in some cases, institutions with loss of that funding. And I think the interesting dynamic here, the only other important dynamic to mention is small institutions, whether they be private or public, honestly, community colleges are this in some ways as well, are very reliant on that student financial aid, right? You look at the students who enroll in those types of institutions, the non-wealthy institutions, the students who are attending often disproportionately draw Pell Grants. And so loss of ability to enroll students who need Pell Grants would be devastating for most of these institutions.
Yeah, and a lot of people asked about Pell Grants. We're going to get into that too. Let's go ahead and close the poll and see where we should start today by taking your questions. Let's see where we landed. All right. So we've got a lot of different answers, but we've got the number one is DEI, second is college finance, third is education department's final mission. We will try to get to as many things as possible, but we're going to start DEI and then we're going to go to college finance. Sound good?
Sounds great. And what an interesting, we're actually pretty evenly split there. I mean, DEI is a little above, but uh, shows we have a bunch of priorities to get to.
Totally. And honestly, not as many people wanted to hear about research as I might have expected. I will give a status update on research because there have been some new developments this past week. But let's get into DEI. So I'm gonna just go straight to our first question from Laura, who asks, are universities required to remove DEI language from websites and materials, close DEI offices, and cancel DEI related programs? Is this enforceable? What are the risks to taking or not taking these actions? What are the benefits to ignoring this demand and conducting business as usual? What do you think, Rick?
Well, this is a good time to give our very important disclaimer that I am not a lawyer. I don't think you are either, although
No,
by the end of this, we both would qualify if we can get credit for experience from reading so many different laws and executive orders, et cetera. Right. The short answer is it varies based on state law. So I'm going to talk about the federal perspective. This landscape has changed significantly in the last week or so. So if you back up to February, you see the Department of Education puts out this Dear Colleague letter, and it had pretty wide-ranging guidance suggesting that all sorts of race-conscious practices on campuses are illegal. And that was widely interpreted and widely reported as, if not explicitly focusing on DEI, likely covering DEI. What happened in the last week is that the government put out a frequently asked questions document that more or less walks back some of the more wide-ranging aspects of this guidance. So it specifically noted that federal law prohibits the education department from controlling the curriculum. So concerns about mentions of DEI or other diversity-related topics in the curriculum that had been running wild should be more put to rest now. That's protected from the feds. It also made the point that using specific terms like diversity, equity, and inclusion is not what breaks the law. What it argues breaks the law is treating students differently based on their race. So it's what you're actually doing. It's not how you label the practices. And I think this really highlights an interesting and important dynamic, which is that a lot of institutions did start scrubbing their websites. A lot of institutions did say they were making changes, and it was not always clear if they were changing what they were doing because they suddenly thought they were breaking the law or because they were trying to draw scrutiny. That's an important distinction. Um, it's a distinction that we'll see how it goes. Um, but I think there's less impetus to make language changes today than there was previously. While we're on the topic of this frequently asked questions document, this clarification to the Dear Colleague letter, a couple other points to hit. It specifically said that interest groups that are focused on specific cultures or heritages are not banned if they are open to all. I know we had received, and there were a lot of questions about whether you could still have a student affinity group for any number of different focuses. And then it also said that celebrations of culture or history are still allowed, again, if they're open to everyone. So you can celebrate Black History Month if your celebrations of Black History Month are not limited to Black students. Presumably that would apply to St. Patrick's Day also, if you want to have a celebration for that, or any number of other less sensitive holidays. So you had some really important guidance notes here. I think there's still a lot left to be fleshed out. You can see a question about this document specifically still casts some negative light on graduation ceremonies focused on specific students. And any number of cases on the ground are difficult to parse without more guidance. And that's where we get into this other question of enforcement. The question is this enforceable? And I guess I have to ask the question in response, which is, what do you mean by enforcement? Do you mean I don't want to be investigated? Or do you mean I don't want to actually be sanctioned? One other key part of this document, this guidance document that came out last week, is that the Department of Education acknowledged it cannot yank your federal funding overnight. That is not the process it will use. There is a relatively lengthy process that involves trying to negotiate a resolution after you have faced the allegations. And then you can actually end up in administrative hearings or court hearings as you fight this, if you so choose. And so I think the question for institutions to answer is, are they afraid of being questioned? Are they afraid of being publicly paraded as potentially violating one of these guidance documents? Or are they afraid of actually losing federal funding? Or are they afraid of losing something in between? That's something that I think a lot of executive offices are probably discussing right now. One other really important thing to note is that the Dear Colleague guidance has been challenged in at least 2 court cases right now. The ACLU, NEA, AFT, and American Sociological Association are the organizations that have brought those challenges. And then as a broader point, this isn't just about this DEI guidance, but it's something that's important to remember as we talk about all sorts of the guidance coming from the administration or the executive orders coming from the administration or the funding freezes coming. They are getting a lot of these actions blocked once they are challenged in court. The DEI guidance has not been blocked to my knowledge, unless it was blocked in the last 15 minutes, but 41 different actions have been taken in court. The courts have blocked 41 different initiatives per the New York Times as of this morning. That is not a small number. So once this ends up in court, who knows what happens? That doesn't necessarily help you decide how to comply or not comply right now, but it is very important from the broader perspective.
So on that question of do you comply or not, we have a couple questions on that. Jamie asks, what percentage of universities are complying and what percentage aren't? Candace also asks, are most or many institutions outwardly complying with reduced DEI efforts and inwardly still pursuing those efforts? I can take a run at that, and then you can jump in as well, Rick. We've been tracking this across the country, and it's all over the map. So some colleges have been adamant that we are still doing the work, but the exact structure and the name is evolving. I will say that this situation can be different in red states. So, for example, Texas public colleges, some of them tried making primarily semantic changes, and Republican lawmakers got so mad that they threatened state funding and passed new restrictions, and a bunch of universities actually had to fire staff over this. So, we are also seeing DEI changes, though, at public and private universities in blue states. So, for example, the University of Colorado system, blue state, they changed the name of their system wide DEI office to Office of Collaboration. We also have Rowan University in New Jersey. They initially renamed their office and then they closed it and reopened a different one and reorganized all the programs. So, we are also seeing, I will say, some colleges change nothing and say, we do not believe that any of our legitimate equity efforts violate federal law. So, for example, we interviewed San Diego Community College District's chancellor, said, nope, no changes here. Uh, One thing that's worth noting is that one of the institutions that initially said, we are not changing anything in response to federal guidance was Portland State University. They got called out after doing this, in a widely shared social media post that tagged President Trump and, newly confirmed Secretary Linda McMahon, and this had already happened beforehand, but, Portland State is one of the first targets for investigation into alleged anti-Semitism by the Trump administration, so the it's, again, all over the map, but there are some interesting sort of trends that we're seeing. Anything to add, Rick?
Yeah, I think the Portland State situation is an important one to watch. Portland State has been, I guess, on a watch list for a while. It has a really strong association with protest, pretty strong association with some things that the right has been skeptical of, to say the least. And so I do wonder to what degree there was already monitoring of their action in this case versus, this just happened to pop up. Another thing I want to mention is that we are still seeing some stories about institutions pulling down DEI language or not allowing certain groups to meet, even, what is it now, 6 days after the federal clarifications came. And in some cases, these changes are what folks who don't like them would call overcompliance or pre-compliance. I think I saw a story today about a group of graduates in Ohio, of Black graduates in Ohio, that has met every 3 years and now can't meet or supposedly can't meet. And so there's still some question about, are institutions still doing this? Even did they start doing it before the new guidance came out? Are they doing it in some cases because they wanted to make changes or thought it was best to make changes to what they're doing to make it more effective? And it's just kind of easy to say we're doing this in response to the guidance. Or, have they, are they really moving because of the federal guidance? There are a lot of questions. It's going to vary based on case by case basis. But overall, I'm really glad you brought up the case of California, and institutions there continuing with their operations, because California has had a pretty strong state law against affirmative action for many years. And DEI is one of those bundles of strategies that has been rolled out to say, how do we serve students who have not traditionally been served on our campuses, even in an environment where affirmative action is not allowed? So the fact that they're doing it there sets up a really good contrast between kind of the federal interpretation of DEI as discriminatory and indoctrination, and maybe more of the interpretation you see on many campuses as a way to help students who have not always felt that they belong on campus, matriculate on campus, and graduate on campus. So we'll see what happens there. One more point on this that I want to make sure I get in. I think there's been an interesting movement in the last few days in that you're starting to see groups that are pro-DEI, or in some cases legal groups, circulating arguments for it in a way that we had not seen during the initial Trump blitz. Either moral arguments for it or arguments that it is legal. And I think that's a really notable thing as the marketplace of ideas fleshes out both what is allowed under the law and what strategies campuses can use that are going to receive widespread buy-in, because that's an important struggle that's going to happen here.
Before we get into college finance, I do want to address diversity related topics in the curriculum because we did get a bunch of questions on this. So, for example, Ava asks, I have spent years updating my course materials and choosing textbooks to be DEI forward. Am I going to have to scrub my course materials of DEI content? Victoria asks, are there indications that academic programs that focus on race or gender might come under enhanced scrutiny? So the simple answer is the federal government cannot interfere in the curriculum. The longer answer is a little bit more complicated, right, Rick?
Yeah, I think this is a point where I'm most closely watching the state level, actually, because we've seen several states either use the bully pulpit, politicians use the bully pulpit to rail against some of these, try to pass legislation or pass some legislation in some cases against these programs or classes. Or, and I think this is something to watch, you'll see some of these programs held up as examples of not meeting workforce needs or not producing enough graduates or enough graduates who go on to earn enough or potentially doing so. So we're seeing a lot of focus at the state level on aligning programs at colleges with what the workforce demands. And are these programs being potentially collateral damage in those moves? Are they being targeted but not targeted, quote unquote? It probably depends on the case, probably depends on the lawmaker, right? The legislative process is never a single motivation. But I think at the state level is where this is most important. Again, because the federal government is constrained by the law. It is not allowed to dictate curriculum.
Yeah, and they like the education department acknowledged that in the latest guidance on Title VI and DEI. They said explicitly, like, we acknowledge we cannot we cannot interfere with the curriculum. So it is not illegal to teach African American studies. Like that is not the case. However, there can be indirect impact. So one of the places that, we've been following at the Chronicle is Florida, which has reshaped general education. And so in a place like Florida, they had a state law that basically said you can't teach these kinds of ideas in mandatory courses, so things that could fulfill general education requirements toward a degree. So 57% of courses across Florida's public colleges were removed from the general education curriculum, and the effect of that is not like the courses are still being taught, but they're not gen ed courses, and that could harm enrollment, which could have an implication for the future of the program. So it's kind of no, the federal government is not going to, and the state government even cannot they can't literally say you can't teach that, or at least that's not been supported in court, but they can indirectly affect what's being taught, right?
Right. There are a lot of small levers you can pull. There are a lot of ways that you can shift the discussion or shift what is most likely to grab a student's attention or move a student into a course that is not explicitly banning a course or going after someone who teaches it. An important point. Sorry, I don't mean to be the guy who always brings up the lawsuit situation, but the Florida law was challenged several weeks ago. That's a 2023 law, if I remember when it was passed, and it took a while to get challenged. And I think that's an example of another key theme that I keep hitting, which is the court system will work through this, but it is slow. Some would probably argue it is behind in some of these cases. And so that does not mean that you will not see short-term effects, and in some cases, short-term harms to folks who are ultimately allowed to do something that the government says you cannot do in the short term.
So let's talk college finance. And just while we get into that, I wanted to remind people that with the Q&A, if it gets a little too overwhelming, you can just close it. You don't have to be in the Q&A. But we do read every single question comment that you put into the Q&A. So even if we don't get to it today, I am going to go, poke around now and see what audience questions we've gotten so far. But even if we don't get to your question today, we do read every single one and they inform our coverage. So I just wanted to say that off the bat. Question from Trisha. Are most higher ed institutions applying hiring freezes due to the federal funding cuts?
I don't want to say most, but I think because I'm not confident that we can say it's most or not most, but I think it is fair to say that we've seen a large number either freezing hiring um, or trying to clamp down on some spending. That may be offering fewer PhD or graduate admissions. That may be offering contingent admissions. I think I saw a couple of places doing. And I think that is indicative of a larger atmosphere of uncertainty. Um, Cash is king in uncertain times is a very old saying in the financial world. And these institutions do not necessarily know what kind of research funding they are going to draw if they are a large research institution. Um, as we've spent the first 20 minutes of this session talking about, some are worried about federal financial aid. And then the broader climate is the Trump administration has tried to freeze various other streams of funding, most streams of funding, at least temporarily. Now, again, the courts have stepped in those cases, but a court injunction is a piece of paper. And it may or may not be enforced. And the administration has shown a willingness to, at very least, slow walk some of the funding that it hasn't even, quote unquote, frozen. Within the Department of Education, it has also cut some grants for things like teacher training. Um, no, none of those single streams or none of those single actions is probably enough to force an institution to have to cut its spending, but you start adding them up and you're going to see more conservative activity on the budget side.
I also wanted to note that, even though this is more on the research side of things, and again, like cutting one research grant, not going to be the end of an institution, but it does have very real impacts. So, our Stephanie Lee reported today that, some scientists who study the LGBTQ community are just straight up seeing their funding canceled in the middle. This is already awarded funding, just canceled in the middle of a grant. There's new reporting out in Nature as well, indicating that these grant cancellations will be quite widespread, including any project studying trans people, DEI in science, environmental justice, research that takes place in China. So, I mean, we're talking about literally like researchers and grad students are just immediately losing their jobs. So, I do want to be clear that, like, on the institutional finance side, there's there's sort of caution being exercised, which is understandable, but, some of the cuts and freezes and things that are happening have already affected people.
That's right. And even if the money gets freed up, that doesn't help you if you don't sit around with a ton of cash on hand. You may have, I don't know, how many days of cash on hand you're comfortable with as an institution. When the federal government stops cutting checks and you start to see that number of days cash on hand dwindling, you as a financial officer start to get very concerned.
We did get a couple of questions from folks about kind of what's happening with Congress and the budget. Very much in flux right now. We are T minus 1 week until a potential government shutdown. So that is another thing to keep in mind. If we do not pass a continuing resolution or a budget by then, Rick, can you offer any sort of at least initial insight on sort of what we can expect from President Trump and from Congress in proposed budget appropriations for both for research as well as for the education department? I mean, the spending framework that, for example, the House passed that just passed, it's just a framework, it's not the final word, but it does call for a lot of cuts, right?
Yeah, I think it makes sense to keep this very high level because there are so many moving parts and so much that could change at this point. But the House framework calls for trillions in cuts. It does not explicitly say where. It assigns different amounts of cuts that various congressional committees would need to find. You start to read the tea leaves. I think it's safe to say they would require substantial changes, probably cuts in research, probably cuts to either cuts or revenue generating opportunities, depending on how you want to do the allocation in federal student aid. And so, yeah, you're going to basically see them looking for ways to squeeze money out of the system. And the reason for this is Republicans want to pass a large tax cut, and they need to pay for it because of the congressional strategy that they have to follow to be able to pass such a bill in a very, very narrowly divided Congress.
Speaking of tax cuts, multiple people asked for an update on the endowment tax. Now, what this is currently it's a 1.4% tax on certain private college endowments. There have been proposals to increase it. Currently, there's one bill in Congress that's been introduced. Basically, that would raise it to 21%. Obviously, it's a massive increase. At this point, we're kind of in wait and see mode on this, I think. But do you have any update for us on the endowment tax issue? I know it's top of mind for institutions.
Yeah, I haven't done a ton of reporting on this lately. But I think I personally expect it to show up as part of this larger package that is looking to offset tax cuts. I know that the current tax could be raised tenfold more, very substantially, depending on which of the proposals you've seen floated in the last few years. And we'll see where it lands. I would be surprised if it does not go up somewhat, but our experience the first time around with the endowment tax when it was added in the first Trump term is that there were some important carve-outs, and there were some ways that the sector was able to minimize the effects of it on particularly like work colleges. Now, which you need to draw from endowments to subsidize their student attendance in a way that arguably some other wealthy institutions do not. We'll see if the congressional power structures look the same to allow that to happen again. But I would expect to see it come in the new package that everyone is waiting for Congress to work out.
So I have seen a few questions coming in live about federal student aid, also several about the dismantling of the education department. So I think we should get right into it. I think we can address both in sort of the same section here. Let's talk about this question that just came in from Frederica from the chat. Can we provide information as to whether SAVE, public service loan forgiveness, and income-driven repayment plans for federal student aid will be dismantled under this administration? Rick, this is much more an area for your area of your expertise than mine. Do you have any insight on this?
Yeah, my understanding is that SAVE is basically dead now going forward. A court blocked it. The Trump administration has no interest, probably less than no interest in reviving it. And key congressional Republicans have their own preferred reforms to the student loan repayment system. Some of the other programs, it's a little less clear. PSLF, everyone worries about because the first Trump administration was accused of slow walking approvals there, and the Biden administration arguably had to do a lot of fixes to make up for folks who were owed public service loan forgiveness, for folks like teachers, like firefighters who have jobs that aren't necessarily the most lucrative in the world, but are a very important service. That's what public service loan forgiveness is for. So there are some questions about how they will make those programs work going forward. One notable but not top line piece of news that I recently saw is that regulators have been cutting some of the folks whose job it is to take complaints about student loan repayment. And I think we'll see if they can make those processes more efficient, or if some of those complaints just pile up. At a higher level, I don't know that making loan forgiveness work quickly is as high of a priority as it was in the Biden administration, which wanted to forgive loans. You're looking at a Republican Congress that wants the student loan portfolio to make money for the government. And loan forgiveness, every loan that is forgiven is a loan that is not generating money anymore. So there are various proposals for new loans going forward and what would happen there. With PSLF specifically, since that was the question, I think I've heard some talk of eligibility limits going forward. We'll see what happens there. But overall, top line, I would expect Republicans to change the debt forgiveness landscape with legislation, or at least attempt to do so.
They might do it as part of budget reconciliation, like probably, yeah.
As part of that one big beautiful bill that everyone is talking about, even though we don't have the text, apparently it's beautiful.
Exactly. So we've got another question that is student aid related, but also related to the education department dismantling. So a couple of people are curious about, are Pell Grants just like disappearing now? Lori asked, are Pell Grants just gone? Will students receive less financial aid if the education department is dismantled? We do have a new Secretary of Education now. Secretary McMahon has been officially installed. Couple of conflicting things. We do have an expected EO executive order coming that would direct the dismantling of the education department. Secretary McMahon has sort of said different things on this, but she's also said she's not interested in cutting education funding, especially financial aid. So, what do you think? Pell Grants? Are they going away? What do you think?
Well, let's talk about Pell, and then I'm going to jump right into the dismantle the department business. But let's put a pin and pause on Pell for just 1 minute here. Um, these grants, which go to low and middle income students, are already facing a shortfall. Um, I will not put you to sleep by explaining why. It is because of the way they are funded. It makes my eyes glaze over, and it is my job to be interested in this stuff. But they are facing a shortfall coming up. So unless Congress were to put more money into the Pell program, you are going to either see eligibility restricted or you are going to see the maximum grant get smaller. Now, that is before we talk about anything else. That's before we talk about a budget bill that could potentially take money out of federal student aid. That is before we talk about dismantling the department. Since we've talked about the budget bill, let's talk about dismantling the department, and we'll circle back to Pell. It has been reported, we'll see if it happens, that as soon as 2 o'clock, so when this webinar ends, we may have the president signing an executive order to ordering the abolition or dismantling of the Department of Education. The text that was leaked said, quote, take all necessary steps to facilitate the closure of the education department. And then this is the language that we have to stress, because I think it's doing a lot of work, to the maximum extent appropriate and permitted by law. So the education department doesn't actually do a ton. I mean, it does some things. It does some very important things to the system, but it doesn't influence college's operations in all the ways that some folks might think that it does. It provides funding. It oversees that funding. It enforces anti-discrimination law. It collects data. And many of those functions are required by law, not all. And there's some debate about what functions you can shift out of the department and how you could restructure it. So Education Secretary McMahon has suggested very strongly that she will follow the president's lead here. Her message, once she was confirmed, was something about a momentous final mission for the agency. So clearly they're going to try to, at very least, make it smaller. And so the question is, where and how do you move the things that it does? So there have been proposals that would, or ideas floated to move, say, the federal student loan portfolio to the Department of the Treasury, anti-discrimination enforcement to the Department of Justice. And, there are some very clear reasons you might want to do that. The question is, would those agencies oversee those functions as effectively and with as much care as the education department does? Opinions will vary drastically on those. I think there are a lot of folks on campus who would say we'd rather have the education department do it. I think there are a lot of folks on some campuses who are not very happy with the way the education department has carried out various functions over the years, and in some cases are very vocally and have been very vocally unhappy about that. And then there's this question of block grants and returning the education department's functions to the states. So the basic idea, which Education Secretary McMahon talked about at her confirmation hearing, was we don't want to reduce funding for things like student aid, but we want to send as much of it through the states as possible, as opposed to routing it through the federal government. Now, the question there is, are the states ready to do it? And what degree of control do they have over that money? I think those are open questions. I think it depends on what latitude the department has administratively, or McMahon has administratively, to make it happen without a congressional change. It depends on what Congress might want to change if it were to be able to pass a bill. And it depends on how much, it depends on whether that bill can pass. So if you keep the programs with all of the requirements as they are today, and then just say, well, the states are going to administer them, that's basically an unfunded mandate for administrative burden on the states, many of which probably don't have offices that are stood up to do this overnight. Um, I started my career as a local government reporter, and I can tell you one thing that elected officials, local elected officials hate is unfunded mandates. I'm not sure that that is what the Trump administration wants to do politically. I'm not sure that it would fly if they tried to do it. So where does all of this end up? Stay tuned. And now let's circle back up to what it means for Pell. Again, stay tuned, because you're looking at a program that is potentially facing cuts without any action. Congressional Republicans have said they want to expand it to more short-term programs. And then we really do have a potential for it being routed through either a different federal agency, or who knows if they could try to find a way to send Pell money through states or through other avenues. The one backstop to all of this, I think, is that Pell is an overwhelmingly popular program. I don't know that I've heard any appetite for eliminating the program. The real question is, in what form does it exist going forward?
I just want to, before we get more into education department, what's going on, kind of material. I do want to acknowledge that a few folks asked both in the Q&A as well as in advance, what is happening with Title III and TRIO? Great question. We would like to get answers for you. So we are going to send our reporters onto the story, and stay tuned, because as far as we know, a lot of TRIO grants are expiring this summer. They're on a 5-year cycle. And so we don't know what's happening. We're going to try to get answers. Stay tuned.
It is a low information environment, and unfortunately, there were a lot of good questions on this and other topics where we just had to put them in a bucket of, we want to run that down, but we don't have anything good to share with you at this moment in time.
I did also want to shout out Aline in the chat, who said, so if executive order happens during meeting, do we shut down our computers, pack our stuff, and go home on quote unquote administrative leave? Unfortunately, the executive order on dismantling ed is probably going to happen after the meeting, so we're out of luck.
And you shouldn't do that anyway, because an executive order, again, it's a piece of paper. Until you have how it's going to be implemented, it's a messaging document.
I did also want to flag, Elizabeth asked this in advance, like going back to your point about some people probably aren't that happy with how the education department has been operating for the last few years. Like, so she asked, why wouldn't higher ed want to dismantle the pervasive direction and control of the federal department that for nearly 50 years has clearly demonstrated its failure to improve student outcomes? I mean, I'm sure that's on people's minds as well.
Yeah, I mean, the education department has had some really high-profile failures. Most recently, its inability to produce an overhauled FAFSA that was not filled with glitches last year. That caused all sorts of headaches for students and administrators and probably faculty members who are dealing with unhappy students. And I think it's a question of, in some cases, the devil you know versus the devil you don't know. Because if the education department goes away, some other regulator could very well have more power. It's a question of a level playing field in some cases. Student aid is mobile across state lines, across county lines, across jurisdiction lines, because it is subject to federal rules. Does that continue if you start to take away the federal regulator? Again, that's just a known unknown, or something that we do not know. And so I think it's just a high risk proposition more than anything. And I think that colleges and the higher ed sector is a very risk averse sector, is honestly the biggest answer there.
So as we get into our last 15 minutes, I do want to pull up one more poll, asking people, what should we make sure to hit in our last 15 minutes together? So we're
And
going to
actually,
pull.
Sarah, as folks do that poll, let me just add one more thing to that last question that I
Yeah.
should have mentioned, is civil rights enforcement is actually where I should have started. There are widespread concerns that states would enforce civil rights laws or not enforce them, and that the landscape there would be very uneven. Whether that is folks from races that have not been traditionally represented on campuses in even numbers or in equitable numbers, or whether that is students with disabilities. that is a very fraught path for many people in this country.
Yeah, I did want to note that a bunch of people in the chat in the Q&A asked about students with disabilities and how the dismantling of the Ed Department, how grant uncertainty is going to affect them. You know, I think it's confusing, frankly. So, President Trump's executive order calling for the end of diversity programs in the public and private sectors, this has been blocked by court. But what it says is not only DEI, but it says DEIA. He phrased it to include accessibility. As we noted earlier, however, Secretary McMahon has said that she's not interested in cutting education funding. Now, education department staffing may be seriously reduced, grants may be reduced, so that may be a problem. Another important note here, frankly, speaking of civil rights, right, is that Office for Civil Rights investigations at the federal level are an important way of holding institutions accountable for providing legal accommodations for students. So if they're hampered, that could be a problem.
Yeah, unfortunately, that is a stay tuned. What's the old saying? Personnel is policy. How you staff really matters about what gets done. Um, you know, can you do it more efficiently? Can you do it more effectively? We're about to find out.
So I think there we go. I think we had a bit of a delay there with the poll, but in our last few minutes, please let us know what you would like to hear more about. I think one thing I do want to make sure that we hit is again talking about sort of surviving the chaos.
Mhm.
Um, no matter what, I think we need to address that at least a little bit. Multiple people have asked for tips for higher ed staff to sort of handle this tumultuous landscape and not burn out. How can we support students? How can we support colleagues? What are actionable steps that we can take? And I think I just want to say up front, like, yeah, the impacts are real, right? Like, people are losing their jobs and their grants right now. Like, it is happening in real time. And so this is seriously impacting people. We did just publish a big package on higher education's workforce that was not directly connected to Trump, but I think it has general strategies that are helpful for anybody. So a couple of ideas that I wanted to flag. How do we help our staff, for example, in times of chaos? Um, Mini sabbaticals potentially for staff to pursue some kind of professional development. Offering better training for bosses, right? Lots of complaints, frankly, in higher ed have to do with inadequate supervision and bad bosses. Um, Another thing people mentioned is even in your budget cutting, don't cut your pizza money. Like, don't minimize opportunities to come together around a shared meal. Those were a couple of ideas. Another thing that was talked about in this advice in our advice package on this. Kevin McClure, who's a really outstanding professor, he gets credit for this. He talked about like sometimes recognizing staff and recognizing the good work they're doing is not. Sometimes it's about formal awards. Sometimes it's about money. Yes, we all know that a lot of higher ed staff are underpaid. Some of it is about funding for professional development. Some of it is just like acknowledgement in non-monetary ways, like genuine personalized notes from supervisors and things like that. Like, so that a lot of that material is in our new workforce issue, and so I will make sure to link to that in the resources, so you can take a look at some of the advice there. But do you have anything to add on that, Rick, on sort of how do we handle this tumultuous? How do higher ed folks handle this tumultuous landscape?
Yeah, I want to emphasize an element of what you said with personalized notes. There's a lot that we can't control, let's face it. Whether you are an administrator trying to help the people you manage, whether you are a faculty member trying to help students, I think a lot these days about the value of personal relationships. There are some things that you simply cannot change in the world. There are some things that I cannot change in the world, but being able to talk openly, talk through things with people is probably the advice that applies to everyone, no matter what your job is, no matter what comes up. Clear communication, letting people know you care, letting people know you care, yes, in your job capacity, but also you see them as people as well, even when you have to make hard decisions, I think can go maybe not the whole way, maybe not even a long way, but I think it helps. And certainly in uncertain times, it it is one of the few strategies that is available to us no matter what our job description is.
All right, I'm going to close the poll and take a look at those results. While that gets pulled up, all right, what we're watching for and surviving the chaos. Clear majorities there. We are sorry that we can't get to everything today, but rest assured, keep asking your questions. We're looking at them. Stefan in advance asked, why aren't more college presidents speaking out? And I think this is a question that's on a lot of people's minds right now. We had Julie in the Q&A also point out, I'm reading the New York Times that people are going silent, including college presidents, for fear of being attacked by President Trump and Elon Musk. University presidents are saying, don't wrestle with the pig, you'll just get muddy and annoy the pig. I mean, what do you think about this? Do you think that, what do you think about how higher ed has responded so far? I think one thing that I would point out on this is that we just published a piece, actually co-published with Open Campus, about Senate Bill 1 in Ohio, which is a massive higher ed reform bill. It would ban faculty from striking. It would ban diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. It would institute new post-tenure review requirements. Massive overhaul. And all of the college presidents at public institutions in Ohio basically, in a coordinated way, said, we're going to stay quiet in hopes of getting a better deal in the state budget. And it didn't, they didn't get more money in the state budget. So that's kind of an interesting development. What do you think about this, Rick?
Yeah, and this is one of the key stories, to be clear. This is one of the key stories that I think both of us are watching going forward is I'll frame it a little more broadly. What strategies is the sector going to use to either ingratiate itself or fight back against some of the policies it does not like, or all of the policies it does not like? There is I've gotten some feedback from folks after I wrote about this topic that effectively boiled down to college presidents are terrified that they're going to invite scrutiny, and that scrutiny is going to lead to bad outcomes for their campuses and their students. And I think that is it's important to consider that psychology for leaders. There are college presidents who are very active on social media, some are better than others. I think it is safe to say that the social media world is not a particularly welcoming or particularly comfortable place for college leaders. There isn't really a model for someone who dominates social media the way that the Trump administration or some of its affiliated voices dominate social media. And so that tends to skew the strategies towards more silence, more reservation. Another really important aspect of this is many campuses adopted some form of institutional neutrality as a policy within the last 2 years, let's say, I think is really the uptick, and certainly in the last year. Some of that is because leaders were either tired of or felt they'd gotten out over their skis or felt they could not respond to certain current events like the war in the Middle East that were so divisive, particularly on a set of prominent campuses. And so now, after you've just adopted this institutional neutrality pledge, this is really the first big test for a lot of these places of those institutional neutrality policies. And now what do? Do you right away rush in and comment just as soon as you have your first test? I think a lot of places are hesitant to do that too. An important note on institutional neutrality is most of the policies I've seen allow presidents or other leaders to comment if their campuses are directly affected. I certainly think funding pauses, research grant cuts, et cetera, all the things we've talked about today count as your campuses being directly affected. So institutional neutrality is an important topic to discuss as far as the current culture on campuses and among leaders. I don't think that any of their hands are tied. I think they send a message when they don't comment. I think they would send a message when they do. And in the last 2 weeks, and especially after I went back and read through the commentary in our last live session that we did, I've really been struck by the number of people who are just desperate for some sort of leadership. And I don't think we've seen it, frankly. Now, maybe that is because, as you mentioned in Ohio, the story that we ran, they're lobbying behind the scenes. Um, and there's probably some merit to that, but lobbying behind the scenes is not the same thing as defending yourself and what you do in a culture that is suddenly very hostile towards the idea of higher education. And I think at some point, either someone will emerge who can defend the idea of higher education or translate why it matters to a skeptical public, or I think the sector is going to continue to take its licks. So yeah, I think that's absolutely the first big story we're watching looking forward. Did I miss anything in that long winding answer on why presidents aren't talking?
I think what I want to do actually is sort of build off of that and pivot toward looking forward. And I think, quite a few people submitted both in questions beforehand as well as now, this is Maritza, for example, said this is the president for the next 4 years. So let's discuss how to stop banging our heads against the wall and change the conversation to how do we sort of support our students? How do we work for the betterment of our students? CW asked, what are strategies for partnering with the administration for productive outcomes? Deborah asks, what are the positives that we can expect in higher ed from the changes proposed? It can't all be negative. And when you were talking, I was thinking about an op-ed that Jeremy Young of Penn America recently published in the Chronicle about higher ed fighting back and what that could look like. And we'll post that in the chat and in the resources that are sent along after this. He talked about, there are some real higher ed reforms that probably like need to happen that can support higher ed in any administration. And that means really focusing on the real roots of public discontent with higher ed. Colleges need to figure out how to charge lower tuition. They need to figure out how to promote greater intellectual diversity. They need to build stronger relationships with local communities and employers and do a better job helping students make progress toward completion and building pathways into the workforce. All of those are things that no matter who is in power, higher ed should be really focused on. Um, what do you think, Rick?
Yeah, I think those are very clear when you look at polling, when you look at the loudest voices in the room. I think those priorities translate pretty clearly. Um, And I think your point on focusing on like what are we here to do is first and foremost, if you work at an institution, it's probably all you can do as you look forward right now is be aware of the broader environment, keep up with the news. It will help you in your day-to-day life, but at the end of the day, it's translating that hopefully we can help you do, translating that into, if you're a faculty member, how do I go about teaching students, making sure that they are able to navigate the world and understand my class and focus on what they're doing, or whether you hold any of these other jobs, knowing, well, if I work in a DEI office, or if I work in student success, or Title IX enforcement, or any of these other issues that could be affected, well, here is the federal landscape, here's the policy landscape, here's what other places are doing, and here's how we move forward in all of that. So it's a complicated situation, it's a complicated moment, but I'll try to adopt how I skate through these situations when I'm a reporter, right? Because it's really easy on a day like today, to get overwhelmed with 5 different news stories that are coming in. You have to prioritize it. I just kind of, what am I here to do today? Who can I turn to for help, and who do I need to talk to? I'm going to cycle back to one other thing. Relationships really do matter, and as much as we talk to each other through screens these days, like it's nice to be able to have conversations like this with you over a couple weeks, and hopefully folks on campus can say, we can talk it out and build relationships with folks even in the hardest of times, and that'll help us figure out where we go from here.
We've reached the end of our hour. Thank you all so much for your fantastic questions, both in advance and live. We read all of them. We hear you. We're gonna go do some reporting on Trio. We also got some great questions about minority serving institutions and kind of impacts for them. We're gonna be doing more reporting on that, so stay tuned. I'm going to be watching what President Trump is potentially going to pursue in terms of cracking down on quote unquote unlawful protests. That's something that I'm going to be following. We may have our first institution that could have federal funding at least threatened with Columbia University. Trump has said that he's going to sort of review their federal contracts. So that's something I'm watching. Anything else, Rick, that you're kind of watching that you want as we sign off today?
No, I think we covered it all. I mean, one thing I would say to everyone who watched, thank you. We're sorry that we couldn't get to all of your questions, but we'll be watching them too.
Absolutely. Thanks, everyone.